Okay, so this is the analysis of opportunities and challenges regarding genetic improvement in emerging Australian agriculture industries, presented by Brad Campbell. Next one, please, Brad. So my name's Craig Hardner. I'm facilitating the seminar today. I'm a Principal Research Fellow in Hort Science. Do a lot of work with horticultural crops at Coffee. Next slide, please, Brad. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the University of Queensland, acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship on the lands in which we meet and the lands that you are viewing this from. We pay our respects to their ancestors and descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, and we recognise their valuable contributions to Australia and global society. Next one, Brad. So as I'm facilitating, I'm here to enforce the rules. And so the seminar is scheduled from 12, it's now 12:03 to 1 o'clock. And after the presentations, there'll be opportunities for questions that Brad will be able to answer, no doubt. So it's important that we get those questions into the questions and answer chat, question and answer button, rather than the live chat. It's only the question and answers that we're looking for the questions. So if you've got something interesting, put it there, please. Next one, Brad. So just quickly introducing Dr. Brad Campbell. He's got 15 years experience in plant biotech, in plant molecular genetics, crop improvement, particularly in sustainable grain and horticultural crops. Brad started off in grain crops, but he's been working with me for the last few years, expanding into horticulture. I know he's got other connections there, and particularly in the areas of food security, feed, by industry uses. So since 2019, he's also been working on the conservation and improvement of taro, which you may have seen through his media engagements, for the Pacific Islands, addressing climate threats like rising sea levels, salinity and drought. His collaborations include genotyping the 2 germplasm collections at CePaCT in Fiji with the FAO Future for Food Security. His projects span from enhancing salt tolerance to studying South-East Queensland's wetlands, targeting resilience in food crops. And I think at the moment he's sitting with Centre for Crop Science, last year's Centre for Horticultural Science, and I think he's coming back to Hort Science next year, but we'll see how we go. So Brad, I'll get you to take it away. Thanks.
Thanks, Craig. Can everyone see my picture? Okay. Okay, thanks for that kind introduction. And I just wanted to also acknowledge the Indigenous custodians on the land in which we meet today. As Craig has already iterated, the title for today's seminar is the analysis of opportunities and challenges regarding genetic improvement in emerging Australian agricultural industries. This project is funded by AgriFutures Emerging Industries, and it involved quite a number of people from various organisations. Although it's just the main players in the group. I just want to hang on a second. So this is the project team that we the main players in the project team that were involved in this project. You've just met Craig. He obviously has a wealth of experience in breeding and genetics, perennial crops. Peter Prentice from QUT, as well as Dr. Fran Humphreys, who was sort of between QUT and Griffith University. So essentially we had people involved with genetic analysis, which was Craig Hardner, Peter Prentice and myself, plus various members of the Northern Territory DPI like Upendra and Chelsea. But we also had a legal team that looked at regulatory barriers for accessing superior genetic material. And we were also tasked with developing 2 detailed business cases. And Mr. Russell Rankin from Food Innovation Partners was responsible for that work. Once again, I'd just like to acknowledge AgriFutures Emerging Industries program for funding this work. Without them, and their financial support and partnership, this wouldn't have happened. So what is the project that we are talking about today? So the project objectives were to empower emerging industries to make informed, objective investment decisions when accessing superior genetic material, whether existing or new, to enhance industry outcomes. So what do we mean by genetic material in this project? We had a very clear definition, and that was units of propagation, example, seeds, eggs, or cuttings, that have repeatable genetic differences, example, families or clones. And what do we mean by superior? So superior meant performance that was better than existing material against defined criteria. So the whole project involved this sort of analysis across 22 emerging industries. And for each industry, we did a review of the opportunities for accessing new superior genetic material. And the legal team also did a review of regulatory frameworks relevant to the access, use, and protection and dissemination of the genetic materials for the target industries. We also did develop 2 detailed business cases, which looked at the benefits of using superior genetic material in their industry programs. So what are the 22 emerging industries we were tasked with investigating? I'm going to briefly go through each one and give you an idea of what it is and what it's about. So the first one is amaranth. Amaranth is a pseudo-cereal from South America. It's sort of seen as the next superfood like quinoa or chia. And Australia is seen as one country that has the growth conditions to be a big player in this species. One of the problems yet is that it needs a developed business case to develop the products in order to get the industry and growers to start growing it. Cocoa, Australia does have the growth conditions for cocoa, and we have a small industry that is growing continuously. It's sort of focused on more of the niche high-end products, which is the same as coffee. Coffee is a ginormous industry worldwide. Australia also has an industry in North Queensland and also in northern New South Wales, and they're focused on the high-end niche products. The next product I used to call guayule until I was told it's called wayule, and this is an alternative rubber species that grows in the deserts of Mexico and Texas. And it's seen as an alternative to the rubber products we get from the tropical tree around Southeast Asia. It's also seen as a way in a warmer climate to have an ongoing rubber industry. Hazelnuts, we all know hazelnuts from products like Ferrero Rocher. Australia has the potential for a huge growing region, and we do have an industry that's developing rapidly. Industrial hemp, this is a species that's been estimated to have up to 25,000 different uses. It's growing rapidly in Australia, and it already has domestic breeding programs. So it's well positioned to become not an emerging industry, but a well-developed industry across Australia. Black soldier fly, what is that? Well, the insect alternative protein industry is huge overseas, and Australia is no different. The black soldier fly species is a naturalised fly in Australia that can metabolize all sorts of waste streams that come from excess food products and things like that to develop alternative protein sources that are used in pet food, aquaculture, possibly even in processed human foods. So it's one industry to look at, and it has a huge future. Jujube, or the Chinese date. This is a species that is usually sold in a lot of Asian supermarkets in Australia. We're able to grow it out of season compared to China, which means we could export it potentially. And it grows very well in Australian conditions. So it has a huge potential, and you might start seeing it in your supermarkets soon. Murray cod, it's probably the next native species besides barramundi to start seeing aquaculture growth. It's developing rapidly. It's already worth $50 million. One of its biggest barriers at the moment is that it just needs a breeding program to take it to the next level. Currently, it uses a lot. It used to use a lot of wild fingerlings and grow them up. Now it's starting to look at domesticating its own genetic material. Native bees has a huge bourgeoising hobby industry, but it also produces very high-end honey and propolis, and it's starting to grow rapidly. And it might eventually become a honey source, even though it's very different to European honeybees. Pine nuts. In Australia, we do have pine nuts, but it's mostly imported from China. In this case, in Australia, we're looking at developing the European stone pine. And compared to the pine nuts you get in your salads these days, it is almost 1 to 2 inches long. It's much bigger, high in nutrition. And there's only literally 2 growers in Australia right now, so it very much is an emerging industry. Pomegranate. This is already pushing the barrier into becoming a mainstream fruit. Most people will probably actually see it in Coles and Woolworths. And Australia, just like where it comes from in the Mediterranean and Iran, it has growing conditions to be a very big industry. Sesame. We all know what sesame seeds are. We have it on the top of our buns. It's almost entirely imported from overseas. We have a demand for 3,500 tonnes of sesame each year, but we only grow ourselves 350 tonnes. The biggest barriers to sesame is the fact that we need genetics that allows it to be mechanised, and we also need mechanised harvesting, and we also need the right yields. Theoretically, Australia has the climate to have a $250 million industry, so it could be up there with wheat or barley as one of the big industries. Sun hemp, it's not actually related to industrial hemp, but it can be used for fibre. It's currently used as a green manure up north around sugarcane farms, seen as an intercrop. It's a legume. It can put nutrition back into the soils, and it can also soak up nitrogen and could be a potential biofuel. Dragon fruit, jackfruit, rambutan. Jackfruit is already starting to be sold in fruit and vegetable grocers, but a lot of these tropical fruits are now becoming mainstream, and they are growing rapidly. Finger lime, it's a native species, only found in Australia. It's usually eaten in high-end restaurants. There's a huge depth of genetic diversity in Australia. Many varieties have been developed, and one of its biggest problems is it's hard to export fresh, and that's the best way to eat it. Kakadu plum. It's got the highest vitamin C of almost any fruit or vegetable. It's almost entirely indigenous harvested. And UQ, the University of Queensland, has a very strong collaboration in trying to develop this native food. Vanilla, one of the big flavourings around the world. It has very specific climatic requirements to grow it. Australia does have areas up north that can meet that requirement. We also have some of the most advanced developed hydroponic systems in the world, and maybe its biggest barrier in Australia is the high labour costs that it requires to develop, but that could come down with more sophisticated farming practices. Lavender. It's a very big tourist industry in Australia. There's already many ornamental breeders. I was lucky enough to go to Bridestow Estate in Tasmania, and it was one of the most amazing sights I've ever seen, seeing all the lavender flowering. It's an industry that is growing. It can grow in all states of Australia, and it has a huge future. The last industry is moringa. It's a native tree species from India, and it's huge in the health food sector over there. It's almost every part of the tree can be used. The only barrier in Australia is that it hasn't been sanctioned by the food standards compliance for consumption in Australia. So this table here is just to give you a quick snapshot of all the industries. I just want to get across that they're all very diverse. They range from perennial trees to annuals. There's a fish species, an insect, some native species. 4 of the species that we've examined are indigenous: finger lime, kakadu plum, Murray cod, and native bees. And when you look at the global value of these species, we have some like coffee that are ginormous industries, down to kakadu plum that is small in both Australia and globally. And as you can see in the outlook column here, We've rated each one according to where we think they're at, whether, for instance, the amaranth industry is developing. Some are expanding, like black soldier fly, they've already developed. Some are stable, some are entirely new, like Waiule. There's no commercial farms yet in Australia, and even globally, it's still developing. So this diagram here is just to give you an idea of the industry decision framework that we used to analyse each industry. We obviously, I'll go into more detail later about the information sources we used to develop the information for each industry, but it's sort of structured into two main areas. We had industry discussion papers where we did a full review of the industry, and then we did an analysis of the opportunities for superior genetic material. Then we had the regulatory side of things, like what are the barriers to importation of superior genetics? And the regulatory legal team looked at things like plant breeders' rights, patents, access and benefit sharing, biosecurity, GMOs. And then Russell Rankin did two-tailed business cases, and we had to choose two industries for those. The main factor or criteria we used for those industries was we wanted a small Australian established industry internationally. So that means an industry that was small in Australia but ginormous overseas, versus a small emerging industry which was small in Australia and very small overseas. And hopefully the industry stakeholders could then look at these business cases and sort of relate those back to their own industry. So I just want to give a quick overview of the structure of the decision-making we made for this project. To assess industry demand, we had to verify, firstly, if there was a strong need or interest from the industry for improved genetic resources. We also had to evaluate Indigenous origin. We had to identify whether industry is relying on native or locally adapted organisms, which requires more intensive engagement. And I'll explain later that Indigenous engagement was outside the scope of this project, so we weren't able to do an analysis of opportunities for Indigenous emerging industries. And then we wanted to rate the likelihood of opportunities. So there was a lot of yes or no questions to rate the likelihood of strategy for accessing superior genetic material and identify activities to strengthen strategy. So information sources. As you can see here, we got information from a range of sources. There was an in silico literature review. We were able to use a lot of the AgriFutures R&D strategic plans, which have been developed quite recently and were very useful. There's a lot of AgriFutures research project reports. We used academic papers, industry reports. There was stakeholder engagement, and there we had up to 52 stakeholders involved in the project, and that was both domestic and international, and that included producers, plant breeders, consultants, public servants, researchers, industry associations. Some of those stakeholders did interviews, some did questionnaires, and we also did some field trips to places like Tasmania, where we managed to meet farmers on the ground and get a real close look at the industries. And of course, we also had expert collaboration. In some of the industry discussion papers, some of the first authors were people highly involved in the industry. I just want to get across that many stakeholders embraced the project and made major contributions to discussion papers. But I also want to mention too that not everyone we contacted responded to our request for interviews. So what is the structure of the opportunity analysis we conducted? Basically, we wanted to explain that the decision-making tool is based on questions that a higher number of affirmative answers means a higher likelihood for the opportunity. We chose these questions to develop or rate their understanding of trait priorities, status of existing and potential genetic material, as well as the ability to develop new genetic resources. So as you can see here, there was 8 questions that we developed, and I'll just go through each one and give you an idea of what that's about. So the first question was about, are the trait priorities for an industry known and well-defined for genetic improvement within Australia? We then looked at, is there genetic material demonstrated to be superior that can be used later on. Is there genetic material in Australia, this is the third question, that is yet to be evaluated? We then had, are there varieties available overseas that could be imported for use by Australian industry? The next lot of questions are about what is the potential to develop new genetic material? And the first question is there domestic improvement programs available that could generate new material? Question 6, is there genetic material being developed internationally in breeding programs that could be imported into Australia? We then asked, are there opportunities to initiate new domestic breeding programs? And finally, are there genetic engineering tools or technology that could be implemented at a commercial level to develop new genetic material? And I just want to reiterate, for each of these, we had rating system, and then we applied that rating system to each question and for each industry. So, like I mentioned before, there were 4 industries that were Indigenous. That included finger lime, Packardoo plum, Murray cod, and native bees. And essentially, we did not evaluate the opportunities for those industries just because it was required that we'd have to indulge in Indigenous engagement, which is quite an extensive process. So there's currently new legislation being formed in Australia that's going to affect upcoming access and benefit legislation about Indigenous knowledge management. It requires a distinct approach for Indigenous engagement, and it's fundamentally different from industry engagement. There has to be respect and inclusion. It requires respectful, comprehensive, and inclusive practices. Time and resources. It involves considerable time, effort, and costs. Specialist assistance often need specialist assistance for proper execution. Collaborative planning must be planned and aligned with all project partners and Indigenous groups. Framework adherence delivered within the framework and expectations of all involved. And there's also reputational and risk if you don't engage in it. So poor engagement can lead to serious reputational damage for all parties or lead to poor results or worse outcomes. So I just want to quickly describe the structure of the industry discussion papers. Basically, a standard structure was developed to ensure relevant information was captured and easily compared across industries. And the structure was developed to inform about trait priorities for genetic improvement. Basically, this is the main structure. You had an overview of the industry. What is the demand for superior genetic material? Are there existing genetic resources? What are the regulatory constraints? And then we did an analysis of opportunities. And each industry discussion paper went for about 12 to 15 pages. So this slide here is just to get across the point that apart from the main players, we also had co-authors. And these are the names of various co-authors that had specialisations in quite a number of industries, and I just want to acknowledge their contribution. So industry demand for superior genetic material. The importance of superior genetics ranged quite a lot. Some industries where there was a critical need for improved genetic material was the sesame industry and the industrial hemp industry. And in fact, they already have quite well formed strategies to access that. Moderate access to demand for superior genetic material was probably how I'd characterise most industries that we looked at. Classic examples are jujube and coffee, where they needed genetic material. They had strategies, but they don't quite. There are different levels. For instance, jujube is more about importing genetics, while coffee is also about importing genetics and not quite at the stage of developing their own domestic genetic improvement programs. There were some industries that didn't have a huge demand for genetics or had complicated arrangements. For instance, the native bee industry, as they rightly point out, is involving a native species. The idea of genetic improving it was controversial. But we went into how they could do that if they chose to do so. The Kakadu plum industry, it required extensive Indigenous engagement, and so we weren't able to look into that aspect of the project. The lavender industry, Brightstow Estate, which is one of the largest industries, said that 80% of their revenue is tourism. They were happy with the genetics they had, but there were potential traits they'd like improved. But that doesn't necessarily translate across the whole industry. And one of the big criticisms for lavender was they had almost no quantitative data to allow a genetic improvement program. Drivers of producer demand. So basically, high-performing genetics ensures consistency, resilience, and quality for domestic and export markets. Some of the characteristics of current genetic material, variety usage varied a lot among industries. It ranged from sun hemp that literally had one variety they used across the industry and it was all imported, versus fingerline that had quite a large depth of genetic diversity in many varieties that have been developed domestically, and industrial hemp that's got more than 20 varieties that they use, and many of them have been developed domestically in scientifically run genetic improvement programs. Some of the deficiencies that were observed, there was uncertainty of identity. Basically, that meant that the varieties that people thought they had, they weren't sure, and they really needed some form of DNA fingerprinting. There was underperformance in key traits, and there was limited genetic diversity. In terms of summarising the priority traits across industries, yield is always the biggest one. Disease resistance was important. Growth rates, particularly for tree species like hazelnut, where they can't have a commercial crop for 10 years now, but in some of the overseas species, it's 4 years. And product quality and adaptation. So what are some of the barriers to adoption of superior genetic material in emerging Australian industries? Industry readiness. So production methods must adapt to local conditions. There's an awareness gaps between limited understanding of genetic advantages. Sometimes there's confidence in performance, concerns over performance and reliability, particularly when importing overseas genetic material. Development costs, this is a big one. Development expenses deter investment. People aren't sure what level of funding is available through R&D avenues, and how much does it really cost to develop superior genetics. A lot of these industries are at the level where they have to improve agronomic practices before engaging in developing genetics. And consumer resistance, preference for traditional products and caution about GMOs. This mainly involved industries in the health food sector like lavender or moringa. Even though gene editing could be quite helpful, do they really want that and can they market it? So what are the results available for genetic and genomic resources? And particularly for existing genetic material, what did we find? First of all, the definition of proven or potential existing genetic material. I just want to get across that. Proven material has demonstrated success in Australian industry conditions. Potential material shows promise, but lacks full validation. Where do most of the existing genetic material come from in Australia? Most industries rely on imported genetics, which is subject to regulatory and IP constraints, with some exceptions like industrial hemp, black soldier fly, and lavender. There's quite a developed ornamental industry for lavender, but not so much for traits like oil production. And some tropical fruits which use domestically developed material, they do their own selections, clones, things like that. What are the global sources of existing genetic material? Access through international collaborations. Sesame is a big one. They have a very strong collaboration with some Israeli and American breeding programs, and they're actually doing variety field trials from some of the genetic material developed out of those. Direct farmer imports, pomegranate, a lot of farmers directly import their material, but there is problems with provenance and knowing what exactly you have. And then there's global germplasm collections. Waiule, the alternative rubber source, is a good example where just about the whole world uses genetic material sourced from the USDA. And there's also, we found a substantial industry difference in knowledge about priority traits. An example would be sesame versus Murray cod. Sesame knows exactly what they need. They've been working for years with Central Queensland University versus Murray cod, where they basically know the traits of importance, but they have no phenotypic data to allow them to make informed decisions. So potential for new genetic material, it's very high. Australia has strong global partnerships enabling access to superior genetics through importation, breeding collaborations, and in international germplasm collections. And Australia is very developed in terms of experience in genetic improvement, variety trials, and advanced R&D. That includes molecular markers, sequencing. I should also reiterate that AgriFutures themselves also has substantial R&D investment in some of these industries. Classic examples are sesame, industrial hemp, and lavender, where there's been $2 million per project fronted for research. Domestic germplasm repositories are rare but needed. Industrial hemp is one of those rare industries, and they have one of the best collections internationally. And I just want to get across that if you do have germplasm repositories, they are a precursor to developing breeding programs. So just to summarise the industry analysis, in terms of importation, most industries were aware of the regulatory requirements for importing germplasm. Variety trials. Most industries are at the level where they could benefit from the establishment of environmental variety trials. Pine nuts, moringa are classic examples. Phenotypic data. Many industries do not have productivity data on key traits. Lavender, Murray cod, native bees. Collaboration with research institutions. Industries such as amaranth and industrial hemp are eager to form partnerships with domestic research organisations, and some of that's already starting to happen. Finance questions, this is always the most common one from industry. The question of R&D funding was a common question for industry. What is and isn't possible? Variety identity. Many industries had a need for DNA fingerprinting of the varieties used in Australia. Prominent examples included pomegranate, jujube, and lavender. So this table here is just a summary of the opportunity analysis we conducted. As you can see here, it's the 8 questions we developed and then each industry. And each analysis has a 1-word rating that we applied to that particular question. I just want to highlight the industries we think there are opportunities to initiate breeding programs. And it's important to point out that the opportunity for sourcing material from existing breeding programs is indicative of activity in Australia. So for the first question, improved definition of trait priorities. There was no clear trend in this analysis, but generally most industries had a good idea of the traits they need improving. A very good rating actually means they don't have a great idea of the traits. So basically an industry like industrial hemp or has a very clear idea of what they want to do versus moringa, which has barely been grown in Australia commercially and needs a lot of work to understand what are the traits of importance. Improved use of proven superior domestic genetic material. As you can see here, it ranges quite extensively. It's about 50-50 in terms of industries that have proven superior genetic material. We then move on to evaluation of potentially superior genetic material. Most industries in the emerging industry have the potentially superior genetic material that could be better used and evaluated. Introduction of potentially superior genetic material from overseas. There was no clear pattern here, but generally most industries had some source that they could. Some industries were had biosecurity barriers that made it hard to import genetic material. Classic example are some of the tropical fruits. Pine nuts is another one. But most industries could source material from overseas. Then we come to the last 4 questions, which is about developing new potentially superior material. And so the first one is by existing Australian genetic improvement programs. It's pretty clear here that there wasn't much opportunity to do that. Obviously, hemp was the exception. You also had black soldier fly. They had a lot of companies that used to like to keep their own IP, but they do have programs. And lavender has an ornamental program, but not a large scientific breeding program. But basically, it's hard to gauge what is and what isn't possible for a new breeding program. So we really advocate that a cost-benefit analysis be done to see what is and isn't possible. But for a lot of these emerging industries, R&D finance is a big problem. Developing new material by existing overseas improvement programs. This is generally positive. For instance, Amaranth, members of the industry already have collaborations with some of the best breeding programs, and they just need to get the finance to develop it domestically. Initiation of domestic improvement programs. It tends to be very limited. So a lot of these industries are still at the stage where they have to improve agronomically more than developing sophisticated breeding programs. But like I said, a cost-benefit analysis is what should happen. The last column is looking at using advanced tools like gene editing, but I should also point out that chemical and radiation mutagenesis is also part of this. So, for instance, gene editing usually requires high-end infrastructure, and it may not be applicable to most of these industries. But in saying that, if the finance is there, it could be very useful. But you have to take into account things like social license, particularly for industries like lavender that have a very strong health food industry that's more interested in organic. But mutagenesis could be very useful for an industry like sesame, where they're trying to get non-shattering seed, which is better for mechanical harvesting, and mutagenesis has produced varieties in the past. So what are the factors that affected the opportunities? There was industry and market needs, demand for superior genetics varies, knowledge of priority traits, readiness for adoption, depends on industry maturity and awareness. Production and propagation. Reliable propagation and genetic identification methods are essential for consistent performance and confidence in superior genetics. Genotype by environment interactions. Different environments affect genetic performance. More data is needed on G-by-E interactions. Consumer and economic factors. Consumer acceptance of genetically improved products and high development costs impact investment. Intellectual property and regulatory considerations. I'll go into that more soon in the talk. Collaboration and funding. Partnerships with domestic and international research groups can provide essential knowledge, resources, and support for genetic advancements. And then adaptability and updates. Ongoing updates are vital to keep industry information relevant. Just have a picture. So I now want to go through the regulatory analysis done by our legal team. As you can see here, they looked at 4 main areas: access and benefit sharing, biosafety, biosecurity, and IP, and plant breeders' rights. And they basically did an analysis of domestic ABS laws for 15 high-interest source countries. So that's countries you want to import genetic material from for an industry. Analysis of domestic IP laws, survey of patent and PBR applications, and the summary of the regulatory considerations in each industry for each discussion paper. So what are the key regulatory issues? So we have access and benefit sharing, laws which require permits and contracts to access germplasm, sequence information, and associated traditional knowledge in Australia and overseas. Biosafety. Biosafety restricts the making, trial, and use of regulated genetically modified organisms. So that's just using gene editing technology, things like that. Well, they're actually different, but I won't go into that now. Intellectual property, plant breeders' rights, and patent laws can protect investment in biological inventions and restrict access to make or use a protected product or process without authorization. And finally, biosecurity issues. Biosecurity regulates the introduction of infectious diseases or pest species, including germplasm, into Australia. So what is the importance of these key regulatory issues? For ABS laws, it's reputational impacts, things like social license, corporate responsibility, moral questions of equity, You also have economic impacts, things like penalties for non-compliance, monetary or non-monetary benefits. For biosafety, it prevents harmful exposure from use of GMOs on biodiversity and human health. In terms of IP, it prevents access to protected germplasm for breeding and biotechnology without a license from the IP holder, protects investment in genomic technologies. And then with biosecurity, you're looking at it protects Australia's biodiversity, industry, and people. So what's the main findings from looking at these four main areas of regulation? Well, for ABS laws, there was no one-size-fits-all approach, complex worldwide. Most countries have ABS laws or policy that affects collection of germplasm and associated information or knowledge, which can be different for each activity within an industry. Meaningful engagement with Australian Indigenous communities is essential for native species and traditional knowledge. When we're looking at biosafety, it prevents harmful exposure from the use of genetically modified organisms on biodiversity and human health. IP, it's relatively consistent protection process worldwide with variations in whether it's available for whole plants and animals. In terms of PBR and patents, they're issued for industries and they vary significantly. Biosecurity, it's quite clear the procedures and processes with governments. Import conditions will depend on the intended use of imported materials. So this table here looks at which countries have domestic ABS and IP laws. As I mentioned before, 15 countries were examined, pretty much 2 to 3 per industry. There was overlap with some countries having the same countries of interest, but basically for each industry, we picked 2 countries where they would probably like to import genetic material. As you can see here, there's no clear pattern. Not every country has ABS laws, about 50-50 didn't. But some countries also had ABS laws with exemptions, and they're the ones with the asterisks. So what were the implications of the finding for ABS compliance? If ABS laws do not apply to a specific collection, there are reputation and economic benefits to obtain permission and share benefits with the source country or community anyway. Good data management and evidence of provenance and permission is key to future commercial development and marketing. Collection and use of Australian native biological resources requires prior informed consent and engagement with Indigenous Australian communities for biological resources and traditional knowledge under their control. The following charts look at intellectual property protection. The first chart looks at the difference between Australia and overseas for plant breeders' rights. And as you can see here, most emerging industries don't have any domestic PBR rights, but obviously industrial hemp and lavender are clear exceptions. But in terms of overseas PBR rights, there's quite a lot. And industrial hemp's a standout, lavender, but coffee and a few other industries as well. In terms of patents, the coffee industry probably has the most patents domestically. And I guess that's to sort of protect them against a lot of the overseas competition. And then overseas, many industries are very strong with patents, and they also tend to be the ones that are globally established. I now want to talk about the 2 detailed business cases that we investigated. And these business cases for accessing superior genetic material, or basically what is the difference between accessing material and not using it on your farming operation. I'll quickly go through the criteria we used to select the 2 industries. Basically, we wanted a globally established industry as one, which basically means it was well developed internationally, but it's emerging in Australia. The other industry we wanted to select was one that was emerging globally. That means it was small in Australia, but it's also small overseas. We wanted to pick industries that were focused on new genetic material for growth. So basically, they wanted improved genetics, high potential. So industries prime for economic expansion in Australia, which means they're going to probably get out of the emerging industry status. And industries with a sizable presence in Australia, which means numbers of farmers, acreage, so on. The 2 industries we ended up selecting was hazelnuts and jackfruit. And just to give you a quick background of each one, so hazelnuts has an international value of $24.8 billion, so it's quite a large industry. Products include nuts, snacks, confectionery, flour, and oil. What is the domestic gap? So demand for hazelnuts is 3,500 tonnes per year, but we only produce 350 tonnes. In comparison, for jackfruit, it's valued at $508 million, which is very small, really. The uses are fresh fruit, processed meat alternatives due to its texture and flavour absorption. Domestic demand is about 750 tonnes per year. So what are the genetic goals of each of these industries? So for hazelnut, they want improved genetics for pest resistance, higher yields, better quality, and earlier production. Earlier production is a big one. Some of the genetics that is grown in Chile, for example, can be ready for commercial harvest at 4 years versus 10 years in Australia, 10 to 12 years in Australia. For the jackfruit industry, their genetic goals were enhanced genetic diversity, higher yields, better flavour and quality, and local adaptation. So let's go through hazelnut. Bit of a background. It's grown in temperate areas of southeastern Australia, as you can see from this map here. There's quite extensive regions where hazelnuts can grow. Some of the main areas are Orange in New South Wales, Myrtleford, Victoria, many of the areas around Victoria, northern Tasmania, but also warmer regions like Mudgee and Narrandera. Key varieties include Tonda de Gaffoni, I don't know if I pronounced that properly, Barcelona and Ennis. And some of the issues they face are pests and diseases. Cockatoo predation can be a big one, susceptible to bacterial blights, aphids. They also use a lot of insecticides, fungicides, pruning, and sanitation to control these. What's the status of the genetic resources for hazelnut? Industry challenges include higher and earlier yields, need for varieties adapted to Australian conditions, particularly for higher temperatures. Thicker shells could produce cockatoo damage, but the industry would prefer to deal with this through adjusting agronomic practices. For global industry, a lot of breeding programs in places like Italy, France, particularly in USA and China. They've got some of the best breeding programs for hazelnut. In terms of germplasm collections, the same countries also have the best germplasms and breeding programs. You're looking at the USDA, Rutgers University, Turkey, Spain, China, etc. So when we developed the business case, or I should say Russell did, for hazelnut, a key task in developing the business case was an economic analysis comparing existing and superior genetics, and modelling was produced using an Excel template. So what were the assumptions for the economic model? Firstly, that Australia produces 350 tonnes of hazelnuts and imports about 3,500 tonnes. Economic modelling was conducted for a 12-hectare orchard, and superior genetic material imported from Chile yields 2 tonnes per hectare at year 4 and 5.5 tonnes per hectare by year 7. Carbor farms have imported superior genetic hazelnut material from Chile to supply Australian farms. And basically, the opportunity return that was discovered was that a 12-hectare orchard of superior hazelnut genetics breaks even in year 4 and generates 2.3 million annually by year 7. You compare that to existing genetics, which breaks even in year 7 and yields only 105,000 per year at maturity. Also, I forgot, sorry, superior genetic hazelnuts would sell for about $36 per kilo. So, jackfruit, what's its background? It's grown mainly in Northern Australia, Northern Territory and Queensland. 78% is produced in Darwin, 2% is grown in the rest of far north Queensland. Key varieties are what they call firm varieties, which are preferred for fresh consumption, versus soft varieties, which are sweeter, often used in processed products. Pest and diseases. Genetic diversity is essential for resistance to pest, disease, and environmental stress. The current focus is for varieties that thrive in Australian conditions. So what's the status of its genetic resources? It has very limited genetic diversity in Australia, and that's one of the big challenges they're fighting. Unknown varieties, they lack knowledge of existing varieties and their performance under Australian conditions. The global industry demand worldwide is increasing, and it's seen as a meat alternative, and it has health benefits. Genetic potential, other countries, particularly Southeast Asia, have a broad range of jackfruit varieties, providing opportunities for genetic improvement. Germplasm collections, as many in Asia, such as those in India and Thailand, which we'd hope to access. But the problem is there's limited access to global germplasm collections. Importation and quarantine restrictions hamper importation for superior varieties. So the modelling for jackfruit, once again, used an Excel template. What were the assumptions for the model? Australia produces 742 tonnes of fruit. Economic modelling was conducted for a 1.5 hectare orchard. Australian jackfruit trees yield 234 kilos per tree, with an estimated yield of 42.8 tonnes per hectare. Superior genetic jackfruit can yield 64.2 tonnes per hectare per year once trees bear fruit. So what was the opportunity return? So a 1.4 hectare orchard with superior genetic jackfruit can generate $21.2 million over 21 years, significantly outperforming standard genetic jackfruit, which yields 16 million over the same period. Annual returns increased from 2 million to 2.7 million with superior genetics. I just want to quickly get across that these Excel templates will be accessible to anyone who reads the final report, and they can be used for your industry if you want to adjust the assumptions for the economic modelling. So what have been the immediate outcomes of the project? I don't want to go through all of them, but already some of the emerging industries have made use of the resources that the university sector can provide. And for instance, some of the innovative food technology programs at the University of Queensland have started working with the amaranth industry. There's been some collaborations made for the coffee industry and cacao. Some industries are taking advantage of R&D to look at DNA fingerprinting of some of the varieties and their provenances. What actually are they growing? Is it really the variety they think it is? And there's huge potential. For instance, sun hemp industry, some of the industry stakeholders would like to do some further study and research so they can become the experts in their field for some of these industries. So what are the predicted future outcomes if industries adopt superior genetics? Well, we'd hope to see improved performance of specific Australian industries through utilisation of superior genetic material, improved understanding of the challenges and opportunities for specific Australian industries to access superior genetic material, improved objectivity of evaluation opportunities for accessing superior genetic material, improved ability to analyse cost-benefit analysis of investment in potential activities for accessing superior genetic material, improved industry efficiency through focus on impact of genetic material and value chains, and improved efficiency of research through knowledge of key issues. So what are the recommendations from the final report? Basically, individual industries develop specific strategies for high-ranked opportunities and customised business case studies. Develop cross-industry approaches for trade prioritisation based on industry engagement and economic approaches. Develop policy for meaningful engagement for development of native organisms. Initiate and maintain Australian collections of existing genetic material. Improve engagement between industries and domestic research agencies to access research networks and cutting-edge technology. Expand network among Australian research providers to support sharing of ideas among industries. Support Australian research and industry engagement with potential international partners, and develop resources to maintain the relevance of information presented in this report. So in summary, we did a foundation analysis for 22 diverse industries, and we developed the most likely strategies for accessing superior genetic material. We found that respectful engagement with First Nations people is required to progress review of genetic material for native organisms. Stakeholder engagement undertaken to source important information. It's an intense process, but builds relationships for further engagement. Investment in superior genetics had a positive impact in both business case studies. Importation of genetic material is most likely option for several industries, but it is costly. Most industries operate at a foundational level and lack the resources or capacity to effectively utilise advanced tools. Collaboration at both domestic and international levels is the most effective way to access superior genetic material and technology. And the report captures a snapshot in time, but resources and circumstances evolve. How can its relevance be maintained into the future? Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Brad. Yes, like the report, it's a lot of information there. So thanks for presenting that. We've got a couple of minutes left for questions, and remember, if you've got a question for Brad, perhaps you can put it in. Can you put it in the question and answer dialogue box? But we do have two, and which is great. They're from industry stakeholders. So the first is from Jade King. And Jade's asked, based on the consultation barriers surrounding native products, specifically finger lime, which Jade's heavily involved in, does this mean there will be very little genetic research undertaken as part of this project and future projects?
That's a great question, Jade. I guess the first point I'd make is that the legislation is still being formed around this issue about access and benefit sharing. And we didn't feel comfortable doing analysis of opportunities based on the fact that our advice could be out of date within a year or two regarding what is and what isn't possible. I'm not entirely sure what the legislation is going to be like, but I don't think it's going to preclude genetic advancement in finger lime. Ultimately, I think at this stage, government institution analysis of genetic improvement might be delayed, but there's still opportunities for industry stakeholders to engage with research institutions. But you're right, there is a question overhanging this area. I don't know if you've got any extra input, Craig, that you would like to add?
So perhaps not at the moment, Jade, but I think it's something that, I mean, the other point to make is that it was a very short project, and any of the engagement would require a lot of planning to undertake the Indigenous engagement. So it's not saying that it's not possible, but it's certainly investment in the Indigenous First Nations engagement is required for development of Indigenous organisms. But I think we can take this discussion further in the next offline as well. So more than happy to chat about that more. I'll just very quickly answer a question from Trevor. And he said, would we present this at the hazelnut industry at another time? And I'm certainly sure we're very happy to do that, Trevor, and tailor it to the industry. And then Omad Ansari from GeneTech has got a question. Thanks for pulling this together. I was thinking about how many resources and projects, like in the hemp industry, are kept as trade secrets by private entities that are not disclosed. Add to the challenge of GMO debates and the tricky laws around hemp being a controlled substance is definitely not an easy space to navigate. Well, perhaps that was a compliment to you, Brad. So thanks very much for that, Omar. At the moment, we've come up to 1 o'clock. There's no more questions, but certainly Brad and myself are very happy to engage further with anybody that wants to explore some of the issues that were discussed here. Brad, do you want to go to the last slide? We'll just close off. This is the last coffee science seminar for the year. There's been a series of science seminars that I want to thank the Coffee Science Seminar Committee and Coffee Communications for organising the diversity of topics covered. If you want to find out more about the science seminars, track down where the recordings of those are, you can use this QR code. and find about what is going to come in the new year. So thanks very much for all your time, and Merry Christmas and New Year, and we'll see you next year. Cheers.